Hello and welcome. Sit back, relax, and let yourself be carried away by the story. Immerse yourself in the story and drift off to sleep peacefully. Please subscribe to my channel and leave a comment. Pont introduction. Oldest traction, there is a staction that has been told in every civilization that's ever existed, in every language that has ever been spoken, across every century that human beings have walked the earth. It is a story about desire, about power, about money, and about the transactions occur between men and women at the intersection of all three. It is not a comfortable story, and it does not resolve into easy moral conclusions, but it is, without question, one of the most revealing stories that history has to offer. Because nothing exposes the values, hypocrisies, and inner workings of a society quite as clearly as what that society does with its desires and what it pays for them. This is a history of courtesans, prostitutes, and the men who sought them. From the temple priestesses of ancient Mesopotamia to the geisha of Edo, Japan, from the Hıstory of classical Athens to the grands horizontaux of 19th century Paris, from the brothels of ancient Rome to the regulated districts of the Ottoman Empire and the pleasure quarters of imperial China. It spans 5,000 years of documented history and is populated some of the most remarkable, most powerful, most tragic, and most misunderstood women and men who ever lived. The vocabulary of this history is itself contested and complex. Words like prostitute, courtesan, concubine, mistress, and companion do not translate cleanly across cultures and centuries. What one society called sacred, another called criminal. What one era considered the height of feminine accomplishment, another condemned as moral depravity. The woman who in one context might be revered as a vessel of divine favor, might in another context be legally persecuted. The man who in one civilization spent his wealth on a celebrated intellectual companion, another considered to have committed a social disgrace. These contradictions are not problems to be resolved. They are precisely the point. They tell us, more directly than almost any other evidence, how power really works, how gender really operates, and how societies manage the gap between what they publicly profess and what they privately desire. What follows is a work of historical narration grounded entirely in documentary evidence of archaeological record, legal archives, literary sources, and scholarly research. Nothing in what follows is invented. The history, in this particular case, does not require embellishment. It is strange enough, rich enough, and revealing enough on its own terms. Part 1. The Ancient Near East. Sacred and Commercial, Chapter 1. Mesopotamia, where the story begins, the earliest documented sexual commerce in human history appears in the written records of Mesopotamia, in the great city-states of Sumer and Akkad that flourished in the river valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates. Bringing rounds begin around 500 BCE. These records, pressed due to clay tablets in cuneiform script and preserved for nearly 5,000 years in the soil of modern Iraq, contain references to women whose role in society combined the sexual, the religious, and the commercial in ways that resist simple categorization. The most discussed of these figures is the Natitude, a class of women associated with specific temples in Babylonian society, who lived in cloistered communities and who could own property, conduct business, and lend money at interest. Extraordinary rights for women in the ancient world. The Nadi were not permitted to have children, which has led to scholarly debate about whether their celibacy was literal or whether they engaged in sexual activity that was ritualized or restricted in specific ways. What is clear is that their status was connected to the temple, to religious practice, and to economic activity simultaneously, in a combination that map neatly onto any modern category more directly relevant to the history of commercial sexuality is the harumtu, a term that appears frequently in Babylonian texts and is most commonly translated as prostitute, or harlot. Those scholars have debated whether the term refers specifically to commercial sexual activity or to a broader social category of women who were outside normal household structures, women who were not wives, not daughters under paternal, not slaves. The distinction enormously for historical acquis, even if the practical conditions of these women's lives often overlapped with commercial sexuality. In any case, the Epic of Gilgamesh, among the oldest works of literature in human history, with versions dating to 2300 BCCE, contains one of the most revealing episodes in the ancient literature of sexuality and gender. In the epic, the wild man Enkidu, who lives among animals and has never known human civilization, is domesticated and humanized through a 6-day, 7-night encounter with a woman named Shamhat, who is described in the text using Akkadian term harumtu. After their encounter, the animals that Enkidu has lived among reject him, and he is drawn inexorably human settlement. Shamhat leads him to Gilgamesh and civilization. The episode has been interpreted in many ways as a mythological account of civilization's origins, as a reflection of human sexuality. What it reveals unambiguously is that in the Babylonian imagination, the figure of the sexually available woman was not merely a commercial convenience, but a cultural threshold, a door between the wild and the civilized. The Code of Hammurabi, the famous Babylonian legal code of around 754 BCE, contains specific provisions relating to the Nadi and other categories of women associated with temples and sexuality. These provisions, which address inheritance rights, property ownership, and the consequences of false accusations, reveal that these women occupied a legally recognized position in Babylonian society that required specific regulation. They were not simply ignored by law or treated as social non-entities. They were complex legal subjects whose rights and obligations required explicit attention. The taverns of ancient Mesopotamia, operated it primarily by women, often women with names that appear in administrative records as independent commercial actors, were sites where commercial sexuality and ordinary social life overlapped. The goddess Ninkasi was the deity of beer and brewing, and her association with both intoxication and fertility suggests the cultural linkage between the tavern world and sexual commerce. In the Babylonian imagination, men who sought the company of women associated with these establishments were not, in Babylonian social terms, engaging in a purely transgressive act. They were participating in a social world that had its own recognized norms and customs. Chapter 2, Egypt. Pleasure at the margins. Ancient Egypt presents a somewhat different picture of organized sexuality and the men who participated in it. The surviving evidence for prostitution in ancient Egypt is more ambiguous than in Mesopotamia, partly because Egyptian scribes were less legalistic than their Babylonian counterparts and left fewer administrative records of commercial transactions, and partly because the evidence we do have is more iconographic, textual, but the evidence is present, and it tells an interesting story. The workers' village of Deir el-Medina, the community of craftsmen and laborers who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings during the New Kingdom period, has yielded one of the most detailed archives of ordinary life in ancient Egypt. Among the ostraka, pottery shards used as writing surfaces recovered from this site are records of personal transactions, legal disputes, and social interactions that provide a rare window into the lives of working-class Egyptians. Some of these records appear to document transactions involving sexual services, though the interpretation remains contested by scholars. The erotic papyri of ancient Egypt, some of the most extraordinary documents to survive from antiquity, depict sexual scenes with an explicitness that shocked their modern discoverers and continues to resist easy interpretation. The Turin erotic papyrus, dating to the New Kingdom period around 150 BCE, depicts a series of sexual encounters between a man of somewhat comical appearance, balding, with a large nose, and a series of women in the elaborate coiffures and jewelry of upper-class Egyptian style. The scenes are clearly meant to be humorous as well as erotic, and scholars have interpreted them as cynical commentary on the pretensions of the wealthy, as entertainment for male workers, and as documentation of the existence of organized prostitution in New Kingdom Egypt. None of these interpretations is mutually exclusive. The relationship between Egyptian temples and commercial sexuality is less clearly documented than in Mesopotamia, but certain festivals, particularly those associated with the goddess Hathor, a deity connected love, beauty, music, and intoxication, created contexts in which social boundaries were relaxed and sexual encounters that might otherwise be transgressive were temporarily licensed. The great festivals at Dendera, Hathor's primary temple, involved enormous quantities of beer and wine, music, dance, and a carnival atmosphere that ancient sources suggest included sexual activity outside normal social constraints. Part 2. Classical Greece. The hetera and the Side Chatty, Chapter 3. The three tiers of women no civilization in the ancient world. Did ancient world develop a more elaborate, more self-conscious, or more intellectually articulated for think about women and commercial sexuality than classical Athens? The Athenians were, among other things, compulsive classifiers. They organized the natural world, the political world, the philosophical world, and the social world into hierarchies and categories, and their treatment of women was no exception. The result of history's most revealing examples of the relationship between gender, class, intellect, and desire. The orator Demosthenes, in a speech from around 340 BCE that has been preserved and studied ever since, articulated what Athenian men apparently considered a natural division of female social function. Wives were producing legitimate children and maintaining the household. Concubines were for physical comfort and daily attendance to needs, and heterai, a word derived from the Greek for companion or associate, were for pleasure and the cultivation of the mind. This tripartite division, stated so casually as to be taken for granted, tells us more about Athenian male attitudes toward women than almost any other single sentence in classical literature. The triarch was a distinctive and remarkable figure. She was not a wife. She had no legal standing as such, and no connection to citizen inheritance. She was not a porne, the Greek term for the common prostitute who worked in the brothels and taverns of Athens. She occupied a third category that was recognized as distinct by law, by social convention, and by the considerable literary attention she received. The hetera was educated, where ordinary Athenian were not. She was witty and intellectually accomplished, capable of holding her own in philosophical debate. She was free, by birth, or by manumission from slavery, or by social position, in ways that constrained her less than a wife. She chose her companions, and her companions were typically the most powerful and accomplished men in Athenian society. The most famous Hera of antiquity was Aspasia of Miletus, who became the companion of Pericles, the dominant political figure of Athens in its golden age around the middle of the 5th century BCE. Aspasia is one of the most extraordinary figures in ancient history, merely because of her relationship with Pericles, but because of what the ancient sources say about her own accomplishments. The philosopher Socrates, as reported by Plato and by Xenophon, spoke of Aspasia with evident respect for her intellectual and rhetorical abilities. Plato's dialogue Menexenus, whether satirical or straightforwardly complimentary, attributes to Aspasia a knowledge of rhetoric so superior that she served as a teacher to Socrates himself. Xenophon's Memorabilia records Socrates recommending that men who wished to learn about social and romantic intelligence should study Aspasia's methods. Aspasia's position in Athens was paradoxical in ways illuminate the entire system. She was not a citizen. She came from Miletus, a Greek city in what is now Turkey. 1. She could never acquire Athenian citizenship, regardless of her circumstances. This exclusion from citizenship actually worked in her favor in one specific respect: the strict regulations that confined Athenian citizen women to domestic sphere and restricted their education and public activity did not apply to her. She could attend symposia, the velerate dinner parties at which Athenian intellectual and political life was conducted, which no respectable, thinkable Athenian woman could. She could engage in philosophical debate, study rhetoric, and participate in the political conversations of Athens' most powerful men. Her relationship with Pericles was long-lasting, deeply affectionate by ancient accounts, and productively intellectual. When he was mocked by the comic poet Aristophanes for his relationship with Aspas, the mockery was directed at the unusual degree of influence she exercised over him, not the relationship itself, which was considered unremarkable for a man of his station. The comic playwright Aristophanes, in his comedies of the late 5th century BCE, made regular reference to the Hetaerae and to the men who sought their company, always as occasions for humor. But humor the veil that reveals by its very existence the extent to which this world was a recognized and prominent feature of Athenians' Kenian life. The names of Hetaerae appear in his plays, in the drinking songs and graffiti of the period, and in the legal speeches and philosophical dialogues of the era, with frequency that makes clear they were not a marginal phenomenon, but a central feature of the world in which educated Athenian men moved. Chapter 4. The Pornai, Athens' other world below the Hetaerae in Athenian social estimation. Far below existed the Pornai, the common prostitutes who worked in Athens' brothels and taverns, particularly in the harbor district of Piraeus. The Pornai were predominantly enslaved women, though free women of the lower classes also worked in this capacity. They were managed by pormoboskoi, brothel owners, typically male, who collected their earnings entirely. They had no negotiating power, no selectivity regarding clients, and no social recognition. The Athenian statesman Solon, who reformed as legal and social structures in the early 6th century BCE, is credited by ancient sources with establishing the first state-regulated brothels in Athens, staffed with enslaved women purchased specifically for this purpose. Whether this account is historically accurate or is a later invention is debated by scholars. But the fact that was told and believed is itself significant. The Athenians apparently considered statement in the organization prostitution to be a rational and even progressive measure, a way of providing and affording an affordable outlet for male desire while protecting the inviolability of citizen women from unwanted advances. The ancient comic poet Philemon, in a fragment preserved by a later writer, describes the Solonian brothels in terms that combine matter-of-fact commercial description with the expectation of male approval. The point of the anecdote, in its original context, was apparently that Solon had been wise and public-spirited in making such a provision. This response, the idea that organized prostitution was a form of public health measure, for which the creator deserved credit, would go through legal and philosophical discussions of sexuality from ancient Athens through 19th century Europe, always revealing the same fundamental assumption that male sexual desire was a force of nature requiring management, and that the women who provided management were performing a social function, however degraded their status might. Chapter 5. Corinth, city of Aphrodite. While Athens was the intellectual and political center of the classical Greek world, Corinth was its commercial center. A wealthy trading city located strategically between the Aegean and Adriatic seas, through which the goods of the Mediterranean world flowed. And Corinth was famous throughout antiquity, its temple of Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, which sat atop the Acrocorinth, the great rock that dominated the city, and which was associated in ancient sources with an extraordinary institution, the sacred Prostitutes of Aphrodite's temple. The ancient geographer Strabo, writing in the late 1st century BCE, described the temple at Corinth as possessing more than 1,000 sacred prostitutes, hierodules, literally sacred slaves, dedicated to the goddess, whose services contributed to the extraordinary wealth of the city. Wealthy men from across the Mediterranean, he wrote, visited Corinth partly for this reason, and the resulting commerce benefited the entire city. The story of Corinth's sacred prostitutes has fascinated historians and travelers ever since, appearing in accounts that range from the scholarly to the sensational. Modern scholarship has subjected Strabo's account to significant scrutiny, and the consensus now is considerably more skeptical than the ancient description. The institution of a widespread temple prostitution in the ancient Greek world. The idea that temples maintained large numbers of women who offered sexual services as a religious act in honor of the deity is now considered by many scholars to be largely a myth, or at least a significant, if exaggeration. The evidence for systematic temple prostitution in classical Greece is considerably thinner than the literary tradition suggests. What did exist were female temple personnel, women who were dedicated to temples in various capacities, and the sexual associations of certain fertility and love goddesses like Aphrodite and her Near Eastern counterparts. The conflation of these two elements into the image of the sacred prostitute may owe more to ancient stereotyping about sexually permissive ports than to historical reality. Nevertheless, Corinth's reputation as a city of unusual sexual license was real and persistent in antiquity. The Greek verb to Corinthinize, Korinthesai, apparently meant, in classical usage, to engage in sexual excess. The city's commercial prosperity, its large population of merchants and sailors from across the Mediterranean, and its association with Aphrodite at it created a social environment in which commercial sexuality unusually visible and prominent. The men who visited Corinth, merchants, sailors, travelers, pilgrims, found a commercial and social atmosphere that combined ordinary trade with erotic availability in ways that were unusual even by ancient standards. Part 3. Rome, Empire of Desire, Chapter 6. Roman sexuality and the soul order. The Roman Empire was, among other things, a civilization with an extraordinary and remarkably open relationship with commercial sexuality. Roman men of all classes, from the emperor to the legionary soldier, patronized prostitutes, and this patronage was not hidden, not shameful in the Roman male estimation, and not illegal. The Roman legal system, the Roman literary tradition, and the Roman all document commercial sexuality with a frankness and detail that has no real parallel in the ancient world. Roman law classified prostitutes, meretrix, from the Latin merio, to earn, as a specific legal category with defined rights and obligations. A registered prostitute was legally infamous, a person of diminished social standing who could not give testimony in court, could not marry a freeborn Roman citizen, and had no claim to the legal protections afforded to respectable women. But she was also legally recognized as a legitimate commercial actor. The registration system, the aediles, Roman magistrates responsible for public order, maintained list of registered prostitutes, gave prostitute a visa, a quasi-official character that distinguished Rome from societies that simply pretended the practice did not exist. The Roman attitude toward male sexual activity was organized around a concept that has no precise English equivalent. The distinction between the active and the passive role in sexual encounters was socially crucial. While the gender of one's partner was considerably less important than modern assumptions, expect a Roman citizen male who took the active role in a sexual encounter with a prostitute, with a slave of either sex, with a social inferior, committed no transgression against Roman social norms, regardless of the partner's gender. What was transgressive? What carried genuine social stigma? Was for a male citizen to take a passive or subordinate role. The organization of commercial sexuality in Rome was shaped by this framework. Brothels provided partners of various kinds for Roman men. Honor was defined by their activity and dominance, not by the gender of their partner. The brothels of Rome, the lupanaria, from lupa, she-wolf, a Roman slang term for a prostitute, were numerous and widely distributed throughout Roman cities. Pompeii, the city preserved by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, has provided the most detailed physical evidence of the Roman commercial sex industry that survives anywhere. The Lupanaire of Pompeii, the city's main dedicated brothel, located near the Forum, is one of the best preserved ancient buildings of its type in the world. Its 8 small cubicles, arranged on 2 floors, each contain a stone sleeping platform. The walls are decorated with painted scenes depicting various sexual positions, which scholars have interpreted it as menus, as erotic art intended to arouse, and as simple decoration. Graffiti on the walls, left by clients, and possibly by some of the workers themselves. Record names, prices, boasts, and occasional expressions of something recognizable as personal feeling. The prices recorded in Pompeian brothels graffiti ranged from 2 to 16 asses, the lower end representing roughly the cost of a modest meal, the higher end something more substantial, but still within reach of ordinary working men. This pricing structure confirms what the literary sources suggest that commercial sexuality in Rome was available across a wide social and economic spectrum. From the cheapest encounters in the most basic establishments to the expensive and elaborate arrangements made by wealthy men with accomplished women who operated on the higher end of the market. Chapter 7. The Delicatae. Rome's elegans companions above the registered meretrix, and far above of the lupinaria workers. Roman society acknowledged a category of women who combined asexual availability with social accomplishment in ways that paralleled the Athenian hetaira. These women, sometimes called delicatae, sometimes described in terms of their specific accomplishments as dancers, musicians, or actresses, moved in the upper levels of Roman society and conducted relationships with the most powerful men in the empire. The Roman elegiac poets of the late Republic and early Empire, Tibullus, Propertius, and above all Ovid, wrote extensively and obsessively about their relationships with women of this type. The women they celebrated in their verses, Delia, Cynthia, Corinna, were clearly respectable Roman matrons. They were free, educated, independent women who chose their lovers on their own terms, and who inspired a body of love poetry that is among the most influential in Western literary history. Whether these women were actual historical individuals or literary constructions, or some combination of both, they inspires a great deal about what educated Roman men found compelling in a female companion. Intelligence, independence, wit, musical or artistic, accomplishment, and the erotic charge of voluntary desire freely expressed. Propertius, in his elegies celebrating his beloved Cynthia, describes a relationship of excessive intensity in which the man is clearly the suppliant and the woman the one with power. This inversion of the normal Roman gender hierarchy, in which the citizen male was supposed to be dominant, was apparently part of the erotic appeal. The woman who could not be commanded, who could be persuaded but not ordered, who might withhold her favor and thereby make its bestowal more valuable. This figure fascinated Roman men in ways that the perfectly obedient could not. The elegiac tradition was a literary exploration of a real social phenomenon. The appeal of the independent woman for men who were otherwise accustomed to total domestic control. Chapter 8. Emperor and courtesan, power. At the top, the emperors of Rome maintained intimacies with accomplished women outside the circle of legal marriage, were sometimes as politically significant as their official dynastic connections. The most celebrated of these relationships, and the most consequential, was that of the Emperor Vespasian with the Wissaes, a freed slave woman who had served as the personal secretary of Antonia Minor, the mother of the Emperor Claudius. Canis had, according to the historian Suetonius, possessed an extraordinary memory that allowed her to retain dictated letters and documents word for word, making her invaluable as a secretary in an era before mechanical copying. After her manumission, her legal freedom from slavery, she became the companion of Vespasian, the general who would eventually seize power as emperor in 69 CE. Following the year of the four emperors, their relationship was long-lasting, deep, and by ancient accounts, something more than merely practical. When Vespasian's wife died, he'd not replace her with a legal marriage. He lived instead with Caenis as his de facto wife, a relationship the ancient sources describe with evident warmth on both sides. The political significance of this relationship was considerable. Caenis, according to Cassius Dio, sold influence and appointments during Vespasian's reign, using her access to the emperor to broker positions and favors for those who could pay. Dio describes this as corruption, but the same sources make clear that Vespasian himself was aware of and arguably complicit in these arrangements. The woman who shared the emperor's bed shared, inevitably, in his power, and had means of exercising that power that no formal legal structure acknowledged, but that the practical workings and pings of imperial government made inevitable. The most infamous name in the history imperial sexuality is not a courtesan, but an empress, Messalina, wife of the Emperor Claudius, whose behavior, as described by Tacitus and Suetonius, made her name a byword for sexual excess for 2,000 years. Whether the ancient accounts of Messalina are historically accurate, significantly exaggerated, or largely fictional is a matter of considerable scholarly debate. She was, after all, described primarily by sources lost to her memory, writing years after her death. But the fact that such descriptions were written, believed, and preserved tells us something important about Roman attitudes toward female sexuality. Its most extreme form was imagined as boundless, insatiable, and ultimately political in its implications. A woman who desired freely was, in the Roman imagination, a woman, the social order that depended on female desire being controlled and directed by male authority. Part 4. The Islamic World. Pleaser and Learned Woman, Chapter 9. Enslaved out poets of the Abbasid world, Abbasid Caliphate, which dominated the Islaminate from Islamic 50 to 100 to 250 D8 C and reached the 8 DEE and reached its kitsch, its cultural peak in Baghdad during the 8th and 9th centuries, produced one of the most extraordinary institutions in the history of female accomplishment. The Khayan, the trained enslaved women who were the primary performers, poets, musicians, and intellectual companions of the Abbasid elite. Their story is inseparable from the institution of slavery. Of slavery, they were property and sold. And yet, within that institution, they achieved a level of cultural accomplishment and social influence that no free women of their era could match. The word Khayan is the plural of Kana, an Arabic term that originally designated a female slave skilled in music and song. By the height of the Abbasid period, the term had expanded to encompass a broader category. Women trained from childhood not only in music, but in poetry, literature, Quranic recitation, rhetoric, and the arts of witty and learned conversation. These women were produced by a training system of remarkable sophistication. Young girls, purchased from across the Islamic world's vast geographic reach, from Persia, from Central Asia, from Spain, East Africa, bought young and trained Orient over years in establishments, functioned somewhere between a conservatory and a finishing school. The best of them were then sold at prices that could reach extraordinarily their valment by the quality and range of their accomplishments. The cultural world of the Abbasid elite revolved around the majlis, the literary salon or gathering, typically held in the evenings, at which poets performed. Music was played, wine was consumed, and intellectual conversation was conducted. The Khayan were central to the majlis as both performers and participants. They did not merely sing and play, they composed, they combated it, they recited poetry, and they engaged in the kind of verbal competition, and wordplay was the central art form of the Abbasid cultural world. The greatest of them were celebrated by the greatest male poets of the era, who dedicated verses to their beauty, their wit, and their learning. The philosopher and literary critic Al-Jaiz, one of the towering intellectual whole figures of the 9th century Abbasid world, wrote about the Khayan with a combination of admiration and analytical precision and discomfort that reveals the complexity of their position. In his essay on the Khayan, he describes their accomplishments with evident appreciation while simultaneously acknowledging that their situation, their enslavement, their compulsory availability, their existence as objects of purchase and sale created a kind of moral and social contradiction that thoughtful men recognized but did not resolve. Among the most celebrated Khayan of the Abbasid period were women whose names have been preserved in the literary sources. Uriwiya, Al-Mamunia, who lived from Pamili Sakamili 70s 97 to 890 CE, is one of the most remarkable figures in the entire history of medieval culture. Born the daughter of an Abyssinian official, she was, for reasons that remain unclear, reduced to slave status as a child, was trained as a Kana, and became one of the most accomplished musicians, poets, and conversationalists of her era. She composed hundreds of songs that were performed throughout the Islamic world. She was known for her wit, her learning, her strong opinions, and her ability to hold her own in debate with the most accomplished male scholars of her time. She outlived 4 caliphs, achieved freedom through manumission, accumulated wealth, and died at an advanced age, having produced a body of work that her contemporaries ranked among the finest of the age. Her name appears in more than a dozen medieval Arabic sources, each of which treats as a figure of genuine distinction. Chapter 10. The beloved in medieval Islamic poetry tradition of Arabic love poetry. Hence its Persian successor tradition, which developed from roughly the 9th century onward, created a body of literature whose relationship with the actual women, and actual desire is complex, often idealized to the point of abstraction, and also rooted in the real social world of the Kayan culture, the beloved in classical Arabic and in Persian poetry, is a figure who combines unattainable beauty with intellectual and musical accomplishment. A combination that corresponds back precisely to the social reality of the Kana as a trained companion rather than as a simple sexual object. The Persian poet Hafiz, who lived in Shiraz from approximately 1325 to 1490 CE, wrote poetry in which the beloved wine and the tavern function simultaneously as literal realities and as symbols of spiritual experience. His ghazals, the Persian lyric form that became one of the great achievements of world literature, address a beloved who may be human, divine, or both in verses whose beauty, ambiguity, and depth have made them central to both secular and religious traditions across the Islamic world for 6 centuries. The tavern keeper and the cupbearer, typically a young male in the Persian convention, but sometimes female, serve in Hafez's poetry as intermediaries between the lover and the divine, in a system of metaphor that drew on the real social world of Persian court entertainment and transformed it into an allegory. The real women who sang and poured wine in Persian court settings provided imagery through mystical union was expressed. The Makama, a genre of Arabic prose fiction that flourished from the 10th century onward, frequently depicts its protagonists navigating the world of traveling merchants, taverns, and the women associated with them, using this world as both a social setting and a moral testing ground. The Kayan appear in the Makamat as figures of temptation, of beauty, of learning, and occasionally of wisdom. Complex figures who cannot be reduced to simple moral categories. Chapter 11, Ottoman Istanbul. The complexity of licensed desire. The Ottoman Empire maintained complex relationship with commercial sexuality that combined legal restriction with practical tolerance, religious injunction with commercial pragmatism. The official position of Islamic law on commercial prostitution was unambiguous. It was prohibited, as was wine and other intoxicants. The practical reality of Istanbul, a city of several 100,000 people by the 16th century, a commercial and administrative hub of the largest empire in the world, was considerably more complex. The Meyhane, the tavern, occupied an ambiguous but recognized place in Ottoman urban life, officially disapproved of, periodically raided or closed by pious sultans or zealous officials. The Meyhane and Nunmeyhane nonetheless persisted throughout the Ottoman period as a social institution that provided wine, music, and the company of female performers, entertainers, to men who sought them. The women who worked in these establishments occupied a position that combined entertainment, companionship, and in some cases commercial sexuality in proporality and proportions that varied by establishment and by individual arrangement. The most celebrated female entertainers in Ottoman culture were the Sengiz, professional female dancers who performed at weddings, celebrations, and In private gatherings for elite men, the Senghas occupied a position of considerable social ambiguity. Their performances were in high demand. Their artistry was genuinely valued, and their company was sought by men from the highest levels of Ottoman society. They were also, by virtue of their public visibility and their movement in male social spaces, considered socially disreputable by the standards of Ottoman respectability that confined women of good family to private domestic space. Part 5 East Asia, the Flotilla, the Floating World and the Pleasure Quarters, Chapter 12. China, the flower boats, and the examination culture Imperia developed. Across its long history, one of the most elaborate and culturally significant traditions of educated female entertainment in world history. The G, a word often translated as courtesan, but encompassing a range of roles from simple prostitute to highly trained artistic and intellectual companion, occupied a complex position in Chinese society that both reflected and challenged the Confucian values officially organized social life. The Chinese imperial examination system, the meritocratic apparatus through which educated men competed for government positions, the prized career path in Chinese society, created a specific social world with specific needs. Young men who spent years studying the classical texts, preparing for examinations in provincial capitals, and eventually Beijing, lived away from their families in a world of putative male scholarship. The courtesan districts of major Chinese cities, the flower districts, as they were sometimes called, catered specifically to this world of educated men, providing companionship, intellectual conversation, music, poetry, and erotic pleasure in a combination that was explicitly valued by the men. Sought it. The Tang dynasty, which ruled China from 618 to 907 CE, and is considered one of the high points of Chinese civilization, saw the development of a courtesan culture of extraordinary cultural productivity. Tang courtesans were expected to be accomplished in the writing of poetry, the central art form of Tang culture, and the literary evidence preserves the names and verses of women who were genuine Lunters, tributors to the Tang poetic tradition. Xu Tao, born around 760 EE, is among the most celebrated. A poet of recognized accomplishment whose verses were collected and anthologized and admired by the greatest male poets of her era, including Bai Jui and Yuan Zhen. She worked as a courtesan in Chengdu, the capital of Sichuan, and eventually acquired sufficient independence and reputation to live in relative autonomy in her later years. She is credited with inventing a particular style of small writing paper, the Xu Tao sheets, still celebrated as a Chinese cultural artifact. The Song dynasty, which followed the Tang and ruled from 900 to 960 to 179 AE, saw the continuation and expansion of the courtesan culture within a more commercially developed urban environment. The great Song cities, Kaifeng, then Hangzhou after the dynasty moved south, were among the largest and most commercially sophisticated cities in the world. and their entertainment districts reflected this prosperity. The Huabin, vernacular fictions stories written in a style accessible to the urban merchant class, frequently depict their male protagonists navigating the Kyrgyzstan districts, falling in love with accomplished women, spending their fortunes, and occasionally achieving marriages that the social order did not officially sanction, but that the stories treated with evident sympathy. The examinee-courtesan relationship was a recurring motif in Chinese literature and cultural imagination for centuries. The scholar who falls in love with the courtesan, who finds in her the intellectual companionship he cannot find at home, who spends his examination money on her company, who ultimately either abandons her for a respectable marriage or, in the more romantic endings, contrives to make her his secondary wife. This story was told and retold in poetry, fiction, and drama throughout the imperial period. It reflected a real social reality that the most educated women in Chinese society were those who worked in the entertainment districts. Education was not provided to women of respectable families. Chapter 13. Japan. The Yoshiwara and the floating world Japan developed in the Edo period that lasted Sen 6 Ren 6 Ensiki 3 to Wheat 1068, one of the most carefully organized, most culturally influential, and most extensively documented pleasure quarters in world history. The Yoshiwara of Edo, modern Tokyo, was a licensed pleasure district established by the Tokugawa shogunate in 1610 and 1617 and relocated to its permanent location outside the city proper in 1656. For 2.5 centuries, it operated as a self-contained world within a world. A walled enclosure with a single guarded gate through which all visitors entered and edited it by its own social codes, producing its own literature and art, and setting the cultural fashions of the Edo period to a degree still shapes Japanese aesthetic culture. Today, the Tokugawa shogunate's decision to establish a licensed pleasure quarter was, in its own terms, a rational administrative response to a social reality. The city of Edo was growing explosively in the early 17th century, and its population was heavily male, dominated samurai, raya warriors, merchants, craftsmen, and laborers who had come to the new capital without families. The shogunate's solution was to concentrate prostitution in a single licensed and regulated space where it could be taxed, monitored, and kept from disrupting the social order of the city proper. The result was an institution of extraordinary longevity and cultural significance. The hierarchy within the Yoshiwara was elaborate and precisely defined. At the lowest level were women who provided basic sexual services in establishments that differed little from the cheapest brothels of any other culture. At the highest level were the oiran, literally leading flower, women of extraordinary area accomplishment who combined sexual availability with cultural refinement in a way that gave them a social position no other woman in Edo period Japan could approach. The greatest oiran were celebrities whose choice ornament, clothing pattern, and personal style set fashion trends that were imitated women across the social spectrum. Their processions through the streets of the Yoshiwara, the elaborate formal walks in which they were attended by younger apprentices in a display of extraordinary stylized movement, were public spectacles watched by thousands. The ukiyo-e, literally pictures of the floating world. The woodblock print tradition that is among Japan's most celebrated contributions to world art was created primarily to celebrate and document the culture of the Yoshimura and the kabuki theater. The great artists of the ukiyo-e tradition, Utamaro, Hiroshi, Hokusai, depicted the oiran of the Yoshiwara with a technical artistication that makes these prints among the most beautiful works of art produced in any culture in any era. Kitagawa Utamaro, working in the 1890s, early 1800s, is particularly celebrated for his portraits of Yoshiwara women, images so psychologically acute, so technically accomplished, and so physically beautiful that they have influenced artists from the Impressionists to the present day. His subjects were not merely decorative objects, but individuals with distinct personalities. And his most celebrated series, the 10 Studies in Female Physiognomy, represents an attempt to capture psychological types rather than simply physical types. The men who visited the Yoshiwara came from across the social spectrum of Edo society, though the rules of the pleasure quarter were designed to accommodate this without creating social disorder. Samurai were technically prohibited from entering in their official capacity, retaining the fiction that the samurai class was above such commerce. In practice, they came in great numbers, wearing unmarked clothing, wealthy merchants, a class that, in Confucian social theory, ranked below farmers, let alone samurai, but that in the commercial reality of Edo period Japan was often wealthier than any samurai, were the primary economic foundation of the Yoshiwara, and they spent extravagantly on its pleasures. The performance of spending in the Yoshiwara was itself a form of social statement. A man who could afford the services of an oiran of the highest rank, who could afford the elaborate rituals of formal entertainment that preceded any sexual encounter, was demonstrating a wealth and sophistication that earned social respect in the merchant world, even as it technically violated propriety. Chapter 14. The Geisha, art against desire, the Geisha tradition, which developed in Japan the early 18th century onward, muse a unique position in the global history of female entertainment. It represents the most sustained and systematic attempt in any culture to separate artistic and intellectual female companionship entirely from commercial sexuality, while existing in close proximity to an institution, the Yoshiwara, that combined both. The first geisha were actually men, entertainers who provided musical performance and comic entertainment at Yoshiwara parties. By the mid-18th century, women had taken over the role and transformed it. The female geisha defined herself explicitly in opposition to the oiran by providing entertainment, dance, music, conversation, tea ceremony, without providing sexual services. This distinction was both genuine and uncommercially strategic. By positioning themselves as artists rather than prostitutes, geisha could charge for their time in ways that the Euron system, with its elaborate and expensive
hierarchy of sexual access, could not. A man who wished to enjoy the company of a skilled geisha hired an artist. The commercial implications of this distinction were carefully maintained. The training of a geisha, which began in childhood, with years of instruction in traditional dance, shamisen playing, tea ceremony, flower arranging, traditional games, and the art of witty and sophisticated conversation, was the most intensive artistic educations available to any woman in Japanese society. The Hanamashi, the geisha districts of Kyoto, particularly the Gion district, which survives and still operates today, were communities of women who trained together, supported each other professionally, and maintained standards artistic accomplishment that were genuinely demanding. The great geisha of the Meiji and Taisho periods were accomplished artists whose cultural influence extended well beyond the entertainment world. Part 6. Renaissance and Early Modern Europe, Chapter 15. Venice. La Cortigiana and the Republic of Desire. Renaissance Venice was, by almost any measure, the most commercially sophisticated and culturally complex city in Europe. A republic of merchants that had accumulated, through 4 centuries, of Mediterranean trade, a wealth and cosmopolitanism that no other European city could match. It was also, by the accounts of its own contemporaries and of the thousands of visitors who passed through it, a city of extraordinary sexual license, a reputation that was simultaneously a point of pride, a source of income, subject of ongoing moral anxiety. The Venetian courtesan tradition produced, in the 16th century, a figure with no equivalent anywhere else of Western civilization. The cortigiana onesta, the honest courtesan, a woman who combined the social freedom and intellectual accomplishment of the ancient Greek hetera with the Renaissance on humanist education and literary culture. These women were not merely sexual companions. They were poets, musicians, scholars, and correspondents who participated in the intellectual life of Renaissance Venice at a level that no respectable Venetian woman could approach. Because respectable Venetian women of the patrician class were kept in conditions of domestic nature that would have been recognizable to an ancient Athenian. The census conducted by the Venetian government in 909, one of the most remarkable demographic documents of the Renaissance period, recorded approximately 11,000 courtesans, prostitutes, and prostitutes in a city with a total population of around 100,000. This ratio, roughly 1 sex worker for every 10 inhabitants, was extraordinary even by the standards of contemporary European cities, and it reflects both the commercial prosperity that made Venice attractive to men from across Europe and the specific social organization of Venetian society that made the Casan a necessary social institution. The most celebrated Venetian courtesan of the Renaissance was Veronica Franco, born in 1546 to a family of the cittadini class, the prosperous, non-patrician citizens who formed Venice's administrative and professional middle class. Franco received an education that was unusual for women of her era. She studied and read the classical authors and developed a facility for verse composition that placed her, by any objective assessment, among the significant poets of her generation. She became a courtesan, whether by choice, by economic necessity, or by some combination of the two. And over the course of her career, she corresponded with, entertained, and was celebrated by the most powerful men in Venice and beyond. King Henry V of France, visiting Venice in 1574 during a grand tour of Europe, was reportedly so impressed by his evening with Franco, he took her portrait back to France as a memento. Franco published 2 collections of verse. The Terz Rhyme of 1575 and the Letter Familiari of 1580 that are among the most remarkable literary works by any woman in the Italian Renaissance. Her poetry addressed, with directness and psychological acuity, the realities of her life as a courtesan. The freedom and the constraint, the wealth and the vulnerability, the intellectual pleasures and the physical demands. She wrote particular force about the relationship between education and power, arguing that women's disadvantage was produced by the denial of education rather than by any natural inferiority. Her letters, written to men of the highest social standing, addressed as equals, making arguments about politics, and about the moral obligations of powerful men, documents of extraordinary confidence and intellectual authority. Chapter 16. The Courtesan of Rome and Florence. While Venice produced the most elaborate and best documented courtesan culture of Renaissance Italy, Rome and Florence had their own versions of the institution, shaped by their particular social and economic circumstances. Rome, as the seat of the papacy, presented a special irony. The center of the Christian church was also one of the cities most notorious for the size and prominence of its courtesan class. The explanation is straightforward enough. Rome in the Renaissance was dominated by an enormous population of unmarried male clergy, from the Pope, from immediate household through the cardinals and bishops to the thousands of priests and monks who populated the city's institutions. These men, officially committed to celibacy, were in practice often in intimate relationships with women that were documented, sometimes publicly acknowledged, and occasionally the subject of gossip, satire, or scandal. Pope Alexander VI Rodrigo Borgia, who reigned from 492 to 1503, maintained a domestic and sexual life of a frankness that scandalized even his contemporaries. His relationship with Vannozza dei Catanei, whom he met when she was in her early 20s, and he was a cardinal, produced 4 acknowledged children, including the notorious Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia. After his relationship with Vannozza cooled, he took his His primary companion, Julia Farnese, a young woman of exceptional beauty from an aristocratic family, who became known as La Bella, and whose brother Alessandro Farnese advanced in his career by his sister's influence, eventually became Pope III. These relationships were conducted with minimal concealment, and the power dynamics they embodied. Women who used beauty and sexual availability to advance their
own families through proximity to power, were not unusual in Renaissance Rome. They were, rather, particularly visible examples, a common pattern. Chapter 17. England. The Tudor and Stuart worlds England's relationship with commercially, and with women who occupied adjacent roles of mistress, companion, enpain, and entertainer had its own specific character, shaped by the particular religious, legal, and social circumstances of English history. The English Reformation, Henry T. Esbroes with Rome in the 1530s, produced a religious culture more hostile to sexual license than the Catholic tradition had been. And yet this hostility coexisted with a royal court tradition in which royal mistresses wielded considerable political influence. The most consequential royal mistress in English history was Anne Boleyn, the woman whose Elise Ater triggered the English Reformation, Pretween's affirmation, to Queen Elizabeth I, and ended with her own execution in 1536. Anne Boleyn was not a courtesan in the technical sense. She was a noblewoman who refused to become Henry's mistress, and who maneuvered, instead, for marriage, with the political calculation and determination that characterized every aspect of her remarkable career. But her story belongs to this history because it illustrates, with unusual clarity, the mechanism by which proximity to royal desire could become the most powerful political force available to a woman in Renaissance, and the terrifying instability of that power. The mistresses of Charles II, who reigned from 1660 to 1685, following the restoration of the monarchy after the English Civil War, operated in a very different political and cultural atmosphere. One shaped by the libertine reaction against Puritan austerity that characterized the Restoration Court. Charles was remarkably open about his relationships and remarkably generous to the women who bore them. Among his most celebrated mistresses was Nell Gwynn, the daughter of a brothel keeper and a former orange seller, an actress at the Theatre Royal, who became one of the most beloved public figures in England. Not despite her origins and her profession, but partly because of them. Her wit, her cheerful acknowledgement of her own position, and her evident affection for Charles made her popular in ways that his more aristocratic mistresses, Louise de Querouaille, the French-born Duchess of Portsmouth, were not. Part 7. The 90th Century. The Grand Horizontal, Chapter 18. Paris, capital of desire. 19th century Paris was, by common European consent, the capital of civilization. And civilization, in minds of the men who made this claim, included pleasure in its most refined and expensive forms. The Grand Horizontal, a French term of the Second Empire period, roughly meaning the great lying down woman, a euphemism that preserved of elegance while being perfectly explicit about its meaning, was the most celebrated, most expensive, and most culturally influential figure in the history European prostitution. Her world was the demi-monde, the half-world of women who were neither respectable wives nor common prostitutes, who moved at the edges of aristocratic and wealthy bourgeois society, who were maintained by powerful men, who set fashion, attended the opera, drove carriages in the Bois de Boulogne, and who served for the men who could afford them, as the primary social arena in which wealth was displayed and masculine status was performed. The demi-monde as a defined social phenomenon emerged in its elaborate form during the Satan Empire of Napoleon III, which lasted from 1852 to 1870. The extraordinary economic expansion of the Second Empire, the rebuilding of Paris under Baron Haussmann, the construction of the Grands Boulevards, the explosion of banking and industrial wealth, created a new class of very wealthy men who were not aristocrats, who therefore lacked the social relationships through which the old aristocracy had organized its pleasures. The Grandes Horizontales provided these men with access to a social world that combined luxury, beauty, and the performance of refinement. A world in which a man's ability to maintain a celebrated courtesan was a form of social credential. The most celebrated Grande Horizontale of the Second Empire was Cora Pearl, born Eliza in Plymouth, England, in 1835. The daughter of a musician, she arrived in Paris as a young woman and, through a combination of personal magnetism, calculated self-promotion, and shrewd management of her own image and affairs, became one of the most famous women in Europe. At the height of her career, she was maintained simultaneously several of the wealthiest men, including Prince Napoleon, a cousin of Napoleon III, and received gifts and payments that funded a lifestyle of extraordinary extravagance. Houses, horses, jewels, parties at which she reportedly appeared emerging from a giant pastry shell on the dining table. Her memoirs, published in 1866, are a remarkable document, frank, self-aware, and occasionally darkly comic about the realities of the life she had chosen and the society she had navigated. The most enduring artistic response to the demi-monde world was produced not by a journalist or a moralist, but by a novelist. Émile Zola's Nana, published in 1888, follows the career of Anna Kupu Nana, from her class in response poverty, through her rise to becoming the most celebrated and destructive courtesan in the city. Zola's novel is extraordinary, not merely as social observation, but as moral analysis. Nana destroys the men who desire her not through malice, but through the simple mechanism of the market. She provides what they want, they pay for it until they are ruined, and she moves on. The novel's final image, Nana dead of smallpox, her famous beauty destroyed, while outside her window the crowds cheer for war, remains one of the most devastating indictments of a social system that created and then consumed such women. Chapter 19. The Regulation Debate. Medicine, Morality and Power. The 19th century was not only the era of the Grand Horizontale, it was also the era in which commercial sexuality became a major focus of social policy, medical science, and moral reform movements across Europe and North America. The debate about how societies should respond to prostitution, whether to regulate it, prohibit it, or attempt to rehabilitate its practitioners, was one of the central social policy discussions of the century, and it reveals with great clarity the assumptions about gender, class, and disease that organized bourgeois Victorian society. The regulation system, adopted in France under Napoleon I and spread across continental Europe throughout the 19th century, required prostitutes to register with police authorities, submit to regular medical examinations for venereal disease, and work in licensed establishments under police supervision. The system's explicit rationale was public health. By identifying infected women and removing them from some circulation until they were cured, the authorities hoped to control the spread of syphilis and gonorrhea, which were epidemic in 19th century cities. The system's implicit logic was characteristically asymmetrical. The disease was sought in women, not in men, because men's participation in commercial sexuality was treated as a natural fact requiring management, while women's participation was treated as a social pathology requiring control. The British system of Contagious Diseases Acts, passed in the 1860s, applied a version of the continental regulation system to garrison towns in England and Ireland. Women in these towns who were suspected, not convicted, merely suspected, of prostitution could be forcibly examined for venereal disease and detained in certified hospitals. If found to be infected, the acts were applied to women only. The men who used their services were not examined, not detained, not subjected to any legal consequence. The obvious injustice of this asymmetry became the basis for one of the most significant feminist campaigns of the Victorian era, led by Josephine Butler, whose National Association for the Repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts eventually succeeded, having the legislation repealed in 1886. Josephine Butler's campaign is important in the history of this subject because it represented the first major attempt to address commercial sexuality not as a medical or moral problem to be managed through the control of women, but as a social problem produced by the inequality of power between men and women and requiring analysis of male demand rather than female supply. Butler argued that the acts treated women as vessels of disease, while treating the men who created the demand as forces of nature beyond reproach. Her analysis, which now seems self-evident, was at the time genuinely radical. Chapter 20. The literary Korchakov and art, fiction, and reality. The 19th century produced a remarkable body of literature about the Kurzen, Ferchen, figure, novels, and plays that transformed real women's lives into cultural archetypes. and that shaped European attitudes toward commercial sexuality for generations. The most enduring of these works drew directly on the lives of real women, and the gap between those real lives and their artistic representations is itself a form of historical evidence. Alexander Dumas fils published La Dame aux Camélias in 2048, a novel based on his own relationship with Marie Blissis, a celebrated Parisian courtesan who died of tuberculosis in 1837 at the age of 23. Marie Duplessis, born en Saint-Plessis in rural Normandy, the daughter of a ragpicker, who had made her way to Paris, and through a combination of beauty, intelligence, and extraordinary social adaptability, had become one of the most sought-after women in the city. Was a real person of considerable complexity. Dumas's novel transformed her into Marguerite Gautier, the suffering courtesan with a heart of gold who sacrifices her love to protect the social standing of her lover's family, and in doing so created one of the most influential female characters in the history of Western literature. Giuseppe Verdi adapted the novel into the opera La Traviata in 1853, and the image of Violetta, the operatic transformation of Marie Duplessis, singing of her freedom and her longing and her death, has shaped audiences' understanding of the courtesan's life ever since. What Marie Duplessis was actually like, what she thought, what she felt, how she understood her own situation, is considerably harder to recover than what Dumas made of her. She left very few documents in her own hand. The accounts of her by contemporaries are uniformly filtered through male perspectives and in male desires, including the desire to see in her the kind of redemptive suffering that the La Dame aux Camélias made canonical. What is clear from the most careful historical reconstructions is that she was extraordinarily intelligent, that she was an autodidact who educated herself through reading and conversation, despite having had almost no formal schooling, that she was genuinely witty and charming, and not merely beautiful, and that she died young in poverty, having spent everything she had earned on a lifestyle that sustained her social position, but left nothing for her own security. The gap between her actual life and the opera inspired tells us about what the 19th century wanted the courtesan to be. A beautiful sufferer whose death absolved the men who had used her and the society that had produced her. Part 8. The 20th century and the modern world, chapter 21. The Jazz Age and the Last Age and the Land I, the Grand Grandy Land and First Demi-Monde Demid were changed everything and about European and American society, and its effects on the world of the courtesan were no exception. The extraordinary social disruption of the war years, the massive loss of life, the economic upheaval, the collapse of the pre-war aristocratic and upper-class social order that had sustained the demi-monde as an institution, combined with the changing status of women in the 1920s to transform the landscape of commercial sexuality and female social possibility in ways that the Grande Horizontale of the Second Empire eras seem like a figure from another world. The Paris of the 1920s was a city of extraordinary cultural creativity and social transformation. American expatriates, European artists, writers, and musicians, and the survivors of the pre-war Parisian world, all present in a city that was simultaneously mourning and celebrating. The women who navigated this world were different from their 19th century predecessors in important ways. The expansion of women's economic opportunities, however limited, the increasing visibility of women in public spaces, the loosening of sexual conventions that the war had begun, all of these changes altered the terms on which women could negotiate their social and economic situations. The most remarkable social figure of the 1920s Parisian world was not a cousin in any traditional sense, but a woman whose rise from poverty to cultural dominance has no precedent in the history of female ambition. Gabrielle Bonneau Chanel, Coco Chanel, whose early career as a singer in Vichy and Moulins brought her into the social circle of wealthy men who became her princes and lovers, and whose use of these relationships to establish herself as a couturier produced one of the most influential artistic, commercial careers in the history of fashion. Chanel's early relationships with the textile heir Etienne Balsan, who provided her with the financial stability and social access that her talent required, and subsequently with the English businessman Arthur Capel, whom she genuinely loved and whose death in a car accident in 1919 devastated her, were conducted in a social world where the line between courtesan, mistress, and independent woman was being actively renegotiated. Chanel used what she had, her beauty, her social intelligence, her extraordinary eye, and her remarkable understanding of what women wanted to wear, to build an empire from the resources that these relationships provided. Her trajectory from the social position of a kept woman to that of one of the most powerful businesswomen was achieved within a single generation. Chapter 22, The Floating World in the Modern Age. Go and beyond times. Relationship, sexuality, and entertainment underwent profound transformation in the 20th century. The Yoshiwara, the great licensed pleasure district that had operated for 2.5 centuries, was officially abolished in 1957 under prostitution prevention law, a piece of legislation that reflected Japan's post-war democratization and its adoption of international norms. The geisha tradition, however, survived, continues to this day in attenuated form, particularly in Kyoto, where a handful of hanamachi maintain the training and performance traditions that were developed in the Edo period. The geisha of the 21st century are artists of genuine accomplishment, trained in traditional dance, music, and tea ceremony, who entertain at exclusive banquets and private gatherings for a small and very wealthy clientele. Their number has declined dramatically, their peak in the early 20th century. There are believed to be fewer than 2,000 active geisha in all of Japan today, compared to tens of thousands at the turn of the 20th century. Their survival is, in one sense, an act of cultural preservation, the maintenance of traditional arts that would otherwise be lost. In another sense, it is a remarkable demonstration of the adaptability of an ancient institution that has managed to redefine itself, generation after generation, in response to changing social conditions. Chapter 23's Legalization, Prohibition, and the ongoing debate, the 20th century, saw the global regulation of commercial sexuality become a major international policy issue, with sharply divergent approaches developing across different countries and regions. The debate about whether to legalize, regulate, prohibit, or, in the terminology of the so-called Nordic model by Sweden in 1999, criminalize the buying but not the selling of sexual services is one of the most contested social policy discussions of the contemporary world. It involves fundamental questions about agency, exploitation, gender equality, and the proper role of law in regulating private behavior. The historical evidence reviewed in this narration does not resolve these contemporary debates. History rarely provides clean policy prescriptions for the present, but it does provide essential context. The idea that commercial sexuality is a product of modernity, or of capitalism, or of Western civilization, or of any other recent or specific development is flatly contradicted by the evidence. Commercial sexuality is documented in the earliest written records of every civilization that has produced written records, and its persistence across 5,000 years of documented histories, that it is connected to features of human social organization that are not likely to be eliminated by any legislative act. What the historical evidence does suggest is that the conditions of those who participate in commercial sexuality, whether as providers or as clients, vary enormously depending on the legal, social, and economic context in which the exchange takes place. The Hetoira of classical Athens, who chose her companions and accumulated wealth, is a radically different figure from the Porne, who had no choices at all. The Oiran of the Yoshiwara, operating within an elaborate formal system, experienced a radically different life from the street prostitute of 19th century London. The Grand Orientale of Second Empire Paris, accumulating jewels and houses and political influence, experienced a radically different world from the woman in the registered Maison de Tournes, who was examined by police doctors and owned nothing of her own earnings. These differences are not incidental. They are produced by specific legal, economic, and social arrangements. Then they are therefore potentially subject to human agency and political decision. Chapter 24. Conclusion. What the story tells us, we have traveled through 5,000 years as of history. In this walked through of ancient Babylon and the symposia of classical Athens. We have passed through the brothels of Rome, and then the harems of Baghdad. We have attended the salons of Renaissance Venice, and the Paris of Saint-Omer, Paris. We have Utopia and the geisha houses of Kyoto. We have read the poetry of women who were bought and sold and who nonetheless managed to create work of permanent beauty. We have followed the careers of women who used the only resources available to them: their beauty, their wit, their learning, their understanding of male desire, to build. It tells us that human desire is remarkably persistent across time and culture, and that every society that ever existed has developed mechanisms for managing it. Mechanisms that reflect that society's values, its economic organization, its treatment of women, and its tolerance for the gap between morality and private behavior. It tells us that women who operated in the spaces created by those mechanisms were not simply passive victims of social forces. They were active agents who navigated the constraints of their world with intelligence, creativity, and sometimes extraordinary success, even as those constraints were genuinely severe, and the costs of transgressing them were genuinely terrible. It tells us that the relationship between male desire and female accomplishment has been, throughout history, deeply contradictory. The most educated, the most intellectually accomplished, culturally influential women in many historical societies were the women who occupied the role of as in companion, or entertainer, women who were excluded from the respectable social sphere precisely because they were in some respects more free than their respectable counterparts. The Hitara who could attend a philosophical symposium while the citizen wife could not. The Kena who could compose and perform poetry while the lady of the household. Cortegiana honesta who could publish books and correspond with men of learning while the patrician woman could not. These figures illuminate, with uncomfortable clarity, the extent to which the restriction of women's freedom and the restriction of women's intellectual life were not incidental features of historical social organization, central ones. And it tells us, finally, that the men who sought these women were not sinking in a transaction that history can classify as simply as they sometimes wished it. It could be classified. They were seeking, in many cases, something that the organized social world of their time denied them elsewhere. The company of women who were their intellectual equals, who could engage with them as full human beings rather than as subordinates or dependents, who could match their wit and challenge their ideas and refuse to be entirely subservient to their desires. That this search was conducted within systems that were often deeply unjust. That the women who provided this companionship often did so under conditions of severe constraint. That the same men who sought equality in conversation denied it in law and politics. These contradictions do not simplify the story. They are the story, and understanding them honestly, fully, without the comforting distortions of either romantic idealization or simple condemnation, is one of the ways that history can teach us something genuinely useful about the world we have inherited and the world we might build.